The following is the first in a series of interviews that I'll be doing with other people who have something to add on art, culture, and history. This is with Culture Explorer, who runs a big account on X and typically does a daily thread on some aspects of art, culture, or even history. You can find links to his social and his website down below. He didn't wish to appear on camera, so unfortunately, you will just have to look at me, but I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. thecultureexplorer.com. And he does a lot of great content around various cultures. He's done a lot of great content on medieval culture, and that's what I brought him in here today to kind of talk about. And he also runs a newsletter where he updates a lot of various interesting things on various cultures, which we'll talk about some of those today as well, like the Shroud of Turin article that he did. So thanks for joining me today, Culture Explorer, and looking forward to talking about your stuff.
Thank you, Memory Medieval. Glad to be on the show.
This is going to be the beginning of some interview series that I'm going to be doing because I want to start bringing in some additional perspectives. I of course, have my perspective on medieval history and medieval culture, but I want to start bringing some other people in to sort of provide a little bit of an extra insight and round things out so that way we can get a little bit of a better perspective. And, I'm not the end all be all on everything. And so one of the things that's really interesting, even though you cover a lot of cultures, your profile picture is technically a medieval figure in Marco Polo. How did you come up with that?
Marco Polo was an interesting character. I read about him in middle school. And during when I was swimming, I used to play Marco Polo. So that character kind of stayed with me for a long time. And I have enjoyed the Arthurian legends. So a few years back, actually about 7-8 years back, I started to travel a bit more to countries where civilization took early root. And these countries included Greece, went to Turkey, went to Spain, and then last summer I went to Italy with focus on Rome and Florence. Florence mainly because it's the birthplace of the Renaissance. So it was high on my list. If there was one place in Italy I would go to, that would be Florence. And so with that in mind, and after going to Italy and seeing all the beauty of Rome and Florence, I was on X one day and came across Culture Critic, and he had posted one of his threads, or he might have posted a question, but I kind of enjoyed his take, and I said, "Oh, this is cool." So I decided to start following him. And this was, I believe, July of last year. Okay. And in August, I decided to say, okay, all right, I'll convert my account into a culture account. I like this. I enjoy this. And so he was one of the motivations that kind of got me here.
So it was kind of a combination of Marco Polo and Culture Critic.
Yeah. So why Marco Polo? Marco Polo, so my background is I've lived in many countries. The U.S., I was born in the U.S., but I also lived in the Philippines, and I've also lived in Pakistan. And so I have seen both the East and the West. And what Marco Polo did was he traveled to the East, and he brought back a lot of information back to the West, and he wrote his book while he was in prison. So when I was looking at the account, I said, who should the avatar be? Marco Polo was the first one that kind of came to my mind, because when I think of culture, when I think of travel, he's someone who bridged the East and the West together. The goal for my account is to kind of do the same, help bridge Western civilization, art, and culture to the East, and Eastern civilization to the West.
So it's interesting because Marco Polo is somebody who I feel like, in my own personal experience, I learn about in school, and it's sort of a brief thing like, okay, Marco Polo, he goes out to meet the Mongols and comes back.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you could tell me a little bit more about the cultural significance of him now that I'm, a little bit more in the historical world. What was sort of the cultural significance, historical significance of that at the time?
At that time, if you think about, if you go back to the medieval days, at that time there was the trade routes were being established. There was a lot of interest in Europe to obtain goods from the east, like spices, silk. The Silk Road was very prominent at that time. I mean, it was a bit closer to its demise, but at the time of Marco Polo, he used the Silk Road to travel, the Silk Route to travel to Central Asia and eventually to China. And that route took him through various different civilizations. Some of the Central Asian cities, such as Samarkand, Bukhara, they were central to the Silk Road. And so he was able to kind of learn a lot about the different cultures on the way, and even because by the time he got to China, he understood quite a bit of what who the Mongols were, and how to kind of interact with them. And from his records, whether some believed to be a little bit more fictional, but uh, even if they were fictional, whether they were true, he was able to get very close to the leadership there. And he was, in fact, a governor of one of the provinces. So imagine a European governing one of Genghis Khan's provinces. And I think that's quite an achievement. I mean, uh, uh, I don't know of any other examples where in Western cultures there was a Chinese or a Mongol governor. When there are several examples, maybe in Central Asia, because they mix quite a bit in terms of intermixing going on. So, like for example, in the Ottoman days, there were a lot of Jews who were in leadership positions in Constantinople, but there are very few examples. So I just find him a very fascinating figure from that perspective. Someone who was able to kind of work together, as you say, irrespective of his cultures. And he basically made a good impression. That's why he was allowed by Genghis Khan to govern his provinces, and he won the hearts of people there as well. Otherwise, yeah.
How long was he there with the Mongols, and then how long until he became a governor?
If I remember correctly, it was like 5 to 10 years at least before he did. But again, the question is this, some people doubt his claims that he was a governor there. I think that's one of the questions in history: is like how much uh, of his tale is really true, and how much of it is fiction.
Wow. Okay.
It's yeah, it's but irrespective. I mean, he went there, he came back alive. I think that's a uh, pretty good.
Oh, it's an incredible feat, no doubt.
Yeah, exactly.
That's incredible. What do you think his lasting impression was on medieval Europe at the time, on the late medieval ages?
I feel that he was pretty. I mean, the reason he came back was, I mean, he loved Europe, right? And his goal was to bring back all his discoveries, bring back the fame. Unfortunately, when he got back, was uh, he was in Genoa, or he was in Venice. Yeah, he was in Venice, and Genoa went to war with Venice, and he was actually leading one of the naval ships and was captured and was imprisoned until towards the end of his life, and that's where he wrote his book. But he definitely had a very, I mean, positive aspect about it. I think he was from a rich family as well. I mean, he wasn't from a like a poor family who went there. He had enough things to travel to get there.
Mm.
He was a merchant by trade.
That's a really fascinating story. I'm sort of not familiar even with him being in prison on his return. Like I said, it's one of those things that you sort of learn about as a kid, and then until you come in touch with it, with an account like yours or somebody else who's sort of retelling the history, you don't really come into contact with that sort of stuff anymore. So that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed about getting back into history. One of the things that I thought was pretty interesting looking through some of your newsletters was that you had written about the Shroud of Turin. I think it was in June. And then just
Oh yeah,
last month, there was that new sort of revelation about having DNA tested, or not DNA tested, but dated the fabric again. And it dated back to the time of Christ. And I was curious, because you had written about it, if you had any thoughts on that as far as the authenticity or how that's going to affect everything, or.
yeah. Actually, that's why I wrote about it. That data that they talked about a month ago, or 2 months ago, was actually from 2 years ago. I think it was just it was like published 2 years ago. They probably have a lot more evidence now, suggesting it was real. There were still some questions at the time when I wrote it, that they were thinking that it's either someone who lived during the time of Jesus, or it was someone who traveled from the Middle East to Europe. There were some question marks, but there were different DNAs. The thing is that with the shroud, from a DNA perspective, from DNA evidence perspective, a lot of people have touched it. And so you have mixing of DNA fragments from different time periods, and that sometimes can confuse things. But I mean, I would assume that something like that is likely real. Um, I mean, the fact that there was Jesus, that's real from our perspective. If there wasn't, I don't think Christianity would have spread like it did. So there had to be someone that kind of preached that message and who was crucified. So I don't have any issues with that. I think the question that you're asking is, do I believe that the Shroud of Turin is real? Now, one thing that I think would be interesting is, uh, so you have the Shroud of Turin, and then you also have Veronica's scarf with this image, right? Have you heard of that?
I think you posted about it recently. I think I saw a
There-
post that you did
yeah,
about it.
yeah. It's so both of them are supposed to have the image of Jesus. So the question is, are those images the same? Even if they're different, I think the question will be is, okay, which one is right? Or are either of those right? But at least that's one place where one can start analyzing. I'm pretty sure they've done some analysis and somebody has answers somewhere. I think we'll be hearing more about it as there's still research going on. And even though they made it very definitive, I think there's still some questions that linger on whether it's truly real or not. And the Pope, from the Pope's perspective, the Pope doesn't care whether it's real or not. It's more that it has become a symbol of what it is. So, from the Vatican perspective, they're happy to have it as a symbol, even though it's real or not. And that's something that's still a powerful thing.
Yeah, you mentioned, I forget what it's called, the veil of something. The other one that you're saying is comparing to the Shroud of Turin. And I saw your post on that, which was pretty interesting. And it was kind of strange how the image, so I'm somewhat of a trained artist. And so the
Mm-hmm.
image was very different from the Shroud of Turin as far as that goes. I would say, I don't have any comment on its authenticity or whatever, but it certainly struck me as very different. What I find compelling about the Shroud of Turin, and which is interesting that it really pops up first for Oh, I didn't have the book here with me. Geoffroy of Charny is really
13th,
where it
14th
first
century.
popped.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and he wrote the Knight's Book of Chivalry. But what I find really interesting about that is how it matches the story of Jesus and the crucifixion with the various
Mm-hmm.
injuries and that sort of thing,
Right,
and then it
exactly.
also is dated to that time. And so, sort of the combination of those two things, because I think with the Shroud of Turin, it would be a lot more debatable if even if the image was somewhat real, if like the injuries didn't line up, if some of those other things, so I find sort of the where those things come together to be very compelling as far as the Shroud of Turin goes. But relative to the veil, I thought that seems a little bit, I'm obviously no expert, but it seems a little bit more suspect just due to the image, because the image appears a little bit
I think
more
so too. Yeah.
cartoonish.
Perhaps maybe it has been a while since I've seen it, so I don't remember if it was cartoonish or not. But that image is, well, it'll be more difficult to have an image on a whale as opposed to on some on a piece of cloth that covered Jesus,
Also
right?
pretty
That's,
interesting is that guy who is I don't know exactly what his expertise is, but he came out with the $1 million bounty for anybody who could reproduce a Shroud of Turin like effect on a piece of cloth. And so far,
uh-huh.
he has not paid out the $1 million bounty to anybody who can reproduce anything like the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, and they say that to reproduce that, you have to actually either produce enough heat, enough energy, uh, that would be equivalent of like 2,000 years, roughly, right? So it's pretty compelling. I mean,
Yeah, I agree. I think it is pretty compelling.
so
Um,
when I came across that, I hadn't heard about it, but the reason I came across Turin was I was researching on Turin and looking at the cathedral there, and I came across that it at least contains the Shroud of Turin. And actually, next year they're going to do. They typically don't display it uh, to public. It's only on certain occasions they display it. And next year would be that one occasion. That'll be
well,
this.
so there you go. For anybody
People
in
will be
Turin, check
making,
that out.
yeah, right. People will be making, a lot of people will be making pilgrimage to Turin next year in 2025 just to see that.
There you go. Well, there's the hot tip for anybody looking for some summer plans next year. You can go see the Shroud of Turin. All right. So you also have made plenty of other threads about medieval related things. You've done some medieval villages, some castles, and things like that. What are some things in the medieval period that have struck you as notable, or that is interesting, people should look into? What are some of your favorite things?
I think one of the most fascinating things about the medieval time is that we have been kind of brainwashed to believe that those were the Dark Ages. And I mean, we read that in history, and I remember high school and college, I recall. And so the medieval period, for the most part, wasn't even interesting. And it became, to me, the only interest it had was really from the perspective of Arthurian legends until I started looking more into it. As I said, traveling to Europe and seeing a lot of the cities that were prosperous during medieval ages. That was kind of surprising. So I think, oh, I mean, Spain, I mean, it was under Muslim conquest for a long time, but places like Granada, Seville, even Barcelona, uh, though Barcelona's a lot more newer, but Madrid, they were all very beautiful, right? A lot of historic buildings are going back to 1,080, some 500, some 1,400, some so that's basically the medieval period. So I mean, you have all these buildings that kind of lasted this long, and uh, so, so they had to be doing something right. So that's the first part. So I started looking more into what is medieval history really about, and you know what, Charlemagne. So really, the first Renaissance in Europe started with Charlemagne. He focused a lot on scholarships, trying to revive a lot of the texts that were lost from Latin and Greek classical text, and started working on transcripts. So as you start reading about that, then you come across, okay, monasteries in Greece. I didn't get a chance to visit Mithra, but I read about the monasteries there. A little short of time. So actually in Athens when I was there, I got somebody pickpocketed my wallet. So I ran into that issue. So I couldn't do a lot more things that
Hold
I
on to your
wanted to.
wallet in Greece. That's the lesson.
Yeah, exactly. So when you read about these monks and they're translating and you're seeing them build these monasteries, it's beautiful monasteries in really very difficult places, remote places to get to, things don't start adding up anymore. Um, and then you look at the Gothic churches, right? They are absolutely impressive. So I recently just did a thread on that. But I mean, a number of accounts have done Gothic churches before. But I did a thread a while back on churches that were actually between 500 and 1080
Mm.
or 1180. They weren't Gothic, but they were still pretty impressive for that time period. This are still exist today. And then you have the Gothic churches, which I mean they're absolutely magnificent. One of the countries that I want to get a chance to visit is France, but that's where Gothic started. And I mean those churches are absolutely beautiful. There's a lot of color, a lot of light. All of a sudden, you read about these things, and it doesn't get talked a lot about. Uh, Mostly from the perspective of because people focus on the Renaissance and everything changed after the Renaissance, but it doesn't look like it. I mean, there was development going on. So, I mean, so you had the Muslim civilizations that were at their peak during the Dark Ages. Then you had the Charlemagne around 800, who started bringing back a lot of the text, and then you had the Gothic churches start rising up in 1200, 1180. I think maybe the first one might be in 1050 or something like that. So within a period of, I would say, 400, 500 years leading into the Renaissance, you all you didn't have was the Roman revival. Basically, civilization everywhere else was beginning to flourish, except for in Rome. Then came the Renaissance,
Right.
and that's where civilization in Rome all of a sudden started to flourish. The Roman Catholic, the Holy Roman Empire, or Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican there became a lot more powerful rather than being. I think before the Holy Roman Emperors were used to be like Charlemagne, but now you had actually people in with very close ties with the Vatican. I think at the time it still did because of the Crusades, but as Europe began to kind of rise out of being more prosperous and being more technology savvy, there was a revival of classical styles in Italy. And the funny thing is that the term Dark Ages was coined by Petrarch, I believe, who was a historian, Italian historian in the 14th century. So obviously they had their own bias as well, right? So
Sure.
basically they termed the period between the fall of Rome and the rise of Rome as the Dark Ages.
And that's something that I've found in my own reading as well, is that, you have that period, the Dark Ages, but that once you start reading about it and exploring it, it's not really dark at all.
Right,
And
exactly.
I've spent really the last weekend, I've been posting about this on X. I just found out about this, the Speculum Maius. Have you heard of that?
Now,
So I want to say it's during the reign of Louis the Ninth, roughly about like the 1250s. This
mhm,
monk slash scholar, who's basically paid by Louis the Ninth and a couple other patrons, I think, He basically
Okay.
spent 29 years writing what's called the Speculum Maius, which is the Great Mirror, I believe is how it translates. And so he wrote an
Okay.
80-book encyclopedia on basically everything that he thought that was either admirable or should be emulated. And it's broken down
Uh-huh.
into, there's three main books, history, doctrine, and something else. But it's an 80-book series that took him 29 years to write. It's got
Okay.
almost 10,000 chapters, and it hasn't even been translated into English. So I can't even go read it if I wanted to read it. So you've got all these historians and scholars or whoever who are like, oh yeah, the Dark Ages. And then you got this guy who comes along and is like, oh yeah, I'll write an 80 book encyclopedia about everything that I think people should know. And they're just like,
Hmm.
we're not going to translate that. Don't bother. It's like, well, how can you call this the Dark Ages where people didn't know stuff and do stuff if we can't even read some of what seems like maybe some of
Right.
the most seminal work of the period.
Right.
Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
so that sort of that has really, I've spent really the last weekend being floored by that. And then it also, Charlemagne is a great example. Alfred is another one, which I believe you wrote a
Oh,
letter about
yeah.
Alfred, about how
Right.
he brought back scholarship and
Yes.
some of these classical texts and things like that. If you
In
wanted to
fact,
add a
he's the
little bit
only
about
king.
Alfred.
He's the only king who has, I think, the Great after his name, or maybe the British king. I don't know if other European kings, but I don't know of any other English king who's named blank the Great.
I think Richard actually, we
It's
don't have to,
blank.
we don't have to, we don't have to get into Richard, but he is referred to as Richard the Great by Ambrose
Oh,
in
is it?
his History
Okay.
of the Holy War. He is referred to as Richard the Great, but that's a little bit more contemporary and maybe a little bit more embellished.
Hmm.
That's prior to being known as Richard the Lionheart. But you might be right. Alfred might be the only English king who, let's say, the Great has stuck.
Yeah, greatest. Right. Exactly.
And Alfred was
So
known for scholarship, right? He was known for sort of
right. Exactly.
same thing as Charlemagne, right?
Yeah, and he was the one who took uh, basically brought independence to England. I mean, or initiated the kingdom, took it from the Danes, what were they called at the time, and then he initiated the early phases of what would be the Renaissance, or what would be an English Renaissance, and that would, I think, at that point you had universities started to flourish after that. Oxford, Cambridge, these were all before Queen Elizabeth, but typically Queen Elizabeth is given the credit for the Renaissance in England, the time when Shakespeare and other uh, other doctrines were being written, I think.
Yeah, that's
But if you
super
go back,
interesting.
yeah, yeah,
I think that's just super interesting, now, like, sort of to go back and just see, like, with Alfred, with Charlemagne, and really in a lot of these times and places that you look prior to the Renaissance, there was starting to be a resurgence of interest in classical texts and a resurgence in interest in classical history and these types of things. And that's what ended up kicking off the Renaissance. It wasn't just that, everybody was just doing nothing and then all of a sudden a couple of guys came along in the Renaissance and figured something out. It was a building of a process over the time, like you've mentioned with the architecture, the crazy architecture, prior to even 1000, in Charlemagne's
yeah.
time or whatever.
In fact, I think the best description I can give is, most people are probably familiar with the stock market, right? And but what happens during like a bull market is the prices go up, right? The market is going up and stocks are improving. Nobody kind of really sees that part, right? It's going slowly. And then all of a sudden towards the end, you get like a bubble pop, right? I mean, everything, because people realize, oh, we're late to the game and we need to start buying. And so everybody towards the end starts flying. And to me, the Renaissance feels like that.
Mm.
The Renaissance was the culmination of this intellectual growth cycle that took place in Europe.
Right, leading up for hundreds of years to that period where you're
Right,
saying that, like,
exactly.
the Renaissance itself is actually kind of like the end of it, where everyone's sort of like, "Oh, I need to get a piece."
Yeah, exactly. And you know what exactly happened after the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance was actually the start of the end of religion.
Right, with the Enlightenment.
Yeah, because people went away from faith and they focused more on the science.
Which is interesting because there didn't seem to be during the medieval period much of a conflict between religion and science.
Right, that came after, right? That came as a. So I think if you look at what I've seen in civilizations, I mean, from various different perspectives, is even if you like one of the larger, one of, if you take a look at the Romans, or you take a look at the Islamic civilization, or you look at take a look at the Greeks, the collapse usually comes right after you hear about, like for example, after Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, you have the collapse. You see a really high level of intellectual knowledge being obtained, and then people kind of becoming very liberal, having a very different views that actually were not necessarily part of what brought them there. So you went to the other extreme, and then you have the collapse. Same thing I see in Islamic civilization, where there was a lot of growth, a lot of knowledge, a lot of intermingling with Christians, and there was a lot of knowledge sharing. And then to the point where people started questioning God. Does God exist? Yeah, that was around 1200, 1100, 1280. And then at that point, they put a clamp on. You can only think this way. So you cannot go outside these limits. And so you exceed a point where everything is up for debate. All the conservative values are kind of destroyed. The conservatives kind of fight back, and they really tighten everything. And then the same thing, I feel like is happening now. Actually, if I look at where everything is becoming very liberal in the country, we're going away from what is norm and kind of going to the far end. And I feel like, and I see again a fight back from the very conservative movement. I mean, I wouldn't call myself either liberal or conservative. I like to stay in the middle. And so you kind of see similar things take forward where, and I think that kind of happens in every civilization before it falls.
That is a really interesting point about how people sort of change their values or change their ideas from what got them there, if you will. And then
Exactly.
how that impacts where things are going, I guess. There doesn't seem to be, I think probably looking back, probably in present time, I don't think there's a lot of foresight involved. It's sort of more of a spur of the moment or
Yes.
shorter term thinking. But that is interesting, that parallel, and how that I don't think. I don't think. I'm trying to think of what the quote is. It's not that history repeats, but it rhymes. I kind of like that
Right.
one because
Exactly.
it's got
Yeah.
sort of that
Yeah.
similar theme to it.
Right. Exactly. And I think we see that consistently. History keeps on repeating itself.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it
I mean,
definitely has those themes to it.
that there is a cycle of civilizations or cycle of political governance or political theory, and that they went through stages of like monarchy and followed by so you had tyranny to monarchy to democracy to mob rule. And I mean, thinking about this, yeah, I mean, I think that kind of cycle. Look at the French Revolution. That's what happened. Like mob rule there.
Right. Yeah. French Revolution. Rome is another one. I mean, I think that's one of
Yeah,
the big
Rome, exactly.
things that
Same thing.
people talk about as Rome is that they feel like
Yeah,
they identify with Rome because of the similarities to society today.
right.
All right. So one of the other things I wanted to ask you about, you had a viral thread about a month ago about why Western art is not dead. And you highlighted
Okay.
15 sculptors who are fighting hard to keep Western art alive. And this thread got a lot of comments, if you will. So, or a lot of people had a lot of opinions on that. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and we can talk about that.
Yeah, so I think we can agree that in general, there's a lot of art in modern times that um, it's questionable. Is it really art? And that gets highlighted. But at the same time, I think there, like when I go visit different countries, I've seen modern art that's actually pretty beautiful, right? They're nice paintings. They're hanging on people's homes. Maybe not in the gallery, but I mean, I think some galleries do have that, but they're not in the museums. But they are beautiful paintings, and maybe they're not at the level of Raphael or Michelangelo. But I still think they're good. So what I tried to do was with paintings as well, a thread uh, of modern art, but I did with sculptures because that was a little bit easier to do because there were a lot of sculptors that I wasn't aware of who were producing great, I think, great work, in my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
and they should be highlighted. That thread was, I think, appreciated by a lot of people. I would say about 70% of the people appreciated it, but there was a 25% who also had a very negative reaction to that because all they see is, in my opinion, that all they see is that if it's not a Michelangelo or Raphael equivalent, then it doesn't deserve to exist. Um, and I think that's the wrong way of thinking. If you're not going to encourage people to paint like them, I mean, it's like a child, right? Yeah, a child is. If you're going to be discouraging to a child at a very early age, they're going to stop painting. So if you're going to have standards that are okay, either we want perfection or nothing, well, you're getting nothing.
That's true.
Right? So the goal is to identify great sculptors who are trying to revive, create the beauty that was in the past. They may not be there, but we don't need them to be there. Maybe in another 100 years, they will have created enough students who will get there. That's only if we appreciate them.
Yeah, that's a
Same
good
thing
point.
happened in the medieval age. It's the same thing that happened in the medieval ages, right? I mean, if you look at the art before that, I don't think that's that great, but it's good. It's not the
Right. Yeah.
best,
If
but
you
it's
had
good.
started analyzing painters in the 1300s, it
Exactly.
wouldn't have gone well. It would have
Right.
been received very
Right.
poorly in sort of an isolated
Right. Even
abstract.
1200s, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
so it takes time to for a society to get to a level where it's creating masterpieces. We don't need masterpieces today. We need enough good art that more people get into it that they think that it's a noble profession.
Yeah, we definitely there's some points that I want to get into here because I definitely agree with that. I think that we need more art and in such a way as to where we're building up patronage networks of people who will pay for art
Exactly.
because that's one of the things that
Right.
really annoys me about all of those types of threads where people will post some sort of, let's say, an architectural comparison, and they'll say, why don't architects build like this anymore? Well, it's pretty obvious. Architects don't build like that because they don't get paid to build like that.
Exactly.
If you had billionaires paying architects to build the greatest castles you could ever conceive of in your life, then they would be doing that. But nobody's paying architects to do that, so they're obviously not going to build like that. You have corporations paying architects to build boxes. And so I think it's the same thing with a lot of whether it's painting or sculpture, these other types of things. It's not just that it's good to be building up to having that be a viable profession and to have people building up the skills, but to be building up the appreciation of it in culture. So that way there can be patronage networks, because there's this sort of meme today that, like, you should do it because you love it. Okay, well, maybe this is a good thread. I'm thinking about doing something like this. You could steal it if you get to it first, but like,
No, go
here's
for it.
here's all of the sculptures that Michelangelo did for the love of it, and it's just like an empty, it's nothing. It's like a bunch of blank. No, he got paid. They commissioned him and they hired him and he got paid. And if I understand, he got paid reasonably well. If you want people to
Yes,
be doing those types of things, then you have to come up with a way to pay them. You have to have people that are willing to pay for that. And that's one of the things that really strikes me, actually, as far as the medieval period relative to modernity, is that there were many instances of many rulers who were willing to pay for things that didn't have a direct, not only a direct financial gain, but in many cases it may have even been things that they never even saw the end result of, like some of those
right.
castles or cathedrals that
Absolutely.
took
Yeah.
200 years or 500 years to complete. The guys who
600,
started
right?
it, yeah, the guys who started it, they never saw the end of it. They never got to
Exactly.
see the completed building or whatever, but they put things in motion that then lasted, not only took hundreds of years to build, but have
Mhm.
lasted for centuries afterwards. And so I think that there's definitely, in my opinion, sort of a poisonous corporate thinking to the modern age where everything has to be a direct monetary benefit. You have to consider next quarter's earnings report. You have to consider what the bottom line is and these types of things. And if you're considering that sort of stuff, then you're not going to get great art. You're not going to get great architecture. You're not going to get the types of things that people travel the world or consider core parts of their culture or consider to be revered monuments or pieces of art or culture, because those things don't have necessarily, if ever, an immediate monetary payoff. So you can't have sort of that way of
Exactly.
thinking and get those types of things.
Exactly. And the other aspect of it is that even if, let's say tomorrow, the government decides, okay, we're only going to build these beautiful buildings, the first reaction is going to be, why are they wasting money on this? Right? And then I've seen this far too often. After something beautiful is built, they go, oh, wow, this is so beautiful. This is what we want. But early in the period, to get to that point, there's so much negativity against it that I think it prevents people from even moving in that direction.
Right.
You
And
have to
that's
you have to be
another
able to
interesting point.
tolerate a lot of
Right.
hate.
Relative to the thread that you mentioned, is that, and I think there is some valid criticisms, but I think to you make an excellent point that you do have to also foster an element of positivity, or an element of, these things are good, or we want these things ultimately. Not to say that anything's above critique or criticism, but you
Yeah,
want to have that environment, that atmosphere of, hey, this is going to be a good thing. We want people to do these things. We want to have sculptors. We want to have
right.
people doing these things.
It's not good enough right now, but my kids or my grandkids, there will be a time that will come that they will enjoy a lot more beautiful things than what we're building right now.
Yeah, that's a great point. Maybe that's like an excellent point to end it on. Is just that generational thinking and building up culture to a point where our kids and grandkids can enjoy something that is superior to what we are able to enjoy at the moment.
Exactly.
So why don't you, before we cut it off, why don't you give us one last thing, tell everybody where they can find you, and if you have anything coming up that you'd like to promote.
Well, yeah, so yeah, you can definitely find me on X. I try to post a thread once a day on a topic that's related to either art or culture. And my account there is at cultureexplorex.com. Oh, sorry, not .com, but at cultureexplorex. You can find me on X there. And then if you want to search me up on a newsletter at thecultureexplorer.beehive.com. So you can look up my articles there, and I usually advertise it. So yeah, if you find me on X, I'm going to continue to focus on aspects, going back into past history and see what has worked in the past. And then I try to compare that with what we're doing right now. So the goal is to learn from the past and hope to apply it to the present.
Love it. Your threads have been great. Your content's been great. The links to all of those will be in the description of the video. If you want to check out any of those, please go check them out. And thank you for joining me today, Culture Explorer.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you so much.